morning. I'm delighted to be here. I'm the acting chair of the Department of History. We're delighted to be one of the sponsors here, along with, again, Deloitte, the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History, and the Rotman School of Management. This session is entitled The Framing of Free Trade and Protectionism, and it's, I don't have a session description, so I guess I'm going to be introducing the individuals in just a moment. I will say that this session is meant to be a historical overview. It began with Joe Martin as wanting to give an entire overview of, this would have been impressive, and an overview of the entire historical survey of free trade between the United States and Canada from the very beginning. And then two excellent papers came in that dealt with aspects of free trade. So it's now being revised so that Joe has half the time, and I'm going to keep him very strictly to half the time. I have my little signs here to keep people to time. And then we'll have one paper on 1854 and one on 1911. I didn't prepare exactly much more introductory remarks than that, so maybe the panel would like to come up. And we will therefore be early. Early. I guess, do I get the first chair so I can flash time to people? Okay, so we have three papers. I will introduce each one as we go. Personally, I hate it when I go to a conference and I realize that all three people haven't been introduced at the beginning and I've missed the introductions. So we'll do them one at a time. Also, some of them are quite long. Joe Martin, in a sense, needs no introduction. We had introduced him like 2 or 3 times last night already. As we all know, he is the president of the Canadian Business History Association, the director of Canadian Business History at the Rotman School. He's been teaching Canadian business history here at Rotman since 2005. One of the themes of his course here is the issue of free trade versus protectionism and mercantilism. Prior to joining the faculty, he was, among other things, president of the Canadian Association of Management Consultants, and he led their fight for free trade in services in 1988. His paper is entitled Trade with the United States, an Historical Overview. The paper will go back to the age of mercantilism and the impact of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It will discuss both the trade wars in the United States, North versus South, and in the UK, industry versus agriculture, and their impact on Canada. Key points from the Reciprocity Treaty of 1854 to the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Cordell Hull will be described and analyzed. And Joe will have 45 minutes.
Thank you, Carol. Before I begin, I would like to make up for some errors of omission last night. Canada's History Society has a table over there with copies of their magazine, Canada's History. One of the issues, going back a few years, it has a cover of the Titanic on the front. And then just above that, why we burned the White House, which may relate to free trade, I'm not sure. In any event, there is an article in here talking about the 10 most important business deals in Canadian history. And this was the work of a group of very senior business leaders. 3 of the examples are trade related. One, the protective policy of Sir John A. 2, the free trade agreement itself, and one other which escapes my memory right now. So I urge you to take a copy of that. I think you'll find it of interest. The second thing is, last night I neglected to thank Larry Herman for the extraordinary effort he's put into getting us some of our top flight speakers today. And the third thing, which I mentioned last night, but I'd like to mention again, is that you'll see students here all day. They are members of the negotiation club. They approached us when they heard about this program and wanted to be involved. We were happy to have their involvement. The Negotiation Club is one of a number of clubs that the students have at Rotman, but they've been very enthusiastic, and they certainly saw the benefit of learning about negotiation at the highest level when the stakes are the trade of two nations. So take time during the day to speak to the students. My purpose is to provide an historical context for the conference, say at a 50,000 feet level, and those who are in more detail can get down to 20,000 feet, but I'm going to start with the Renaissance and the age of mercantilism, come forward to the end of the 19th century in Canada, and then look at different parts of the 20th century up to past the Auto Pact, but up to that point I'm talking as an historian. I'll only say a few words on the free trade agreement, but there I'll be talking as a person who was president of a small trade association in the days leading up to the vote. Now, first of all, how do I get that slide up? Right. Forward this one. Before we get into this discussion of free trade, I thought I'd like to show you this slide. Last year, we had a professor here by the name of Chris Kobrak, who unfortunately died, but he had marvelous international connections. And so he invited Jeff Jones to come and speak to a group here. And Jeff Jones is the head of the history department of the Harvard Business School, where they have 20 business historians, and he's a man of international repute. And this was 3 or 4 years ago, long before the Trump phenomenon occurred, but this slide really startled me, because I'd sort of assumed that in what he calls the second global economy, that was just going to keep on going. That was how I felt. But, you know, having read this morning's newspaper, and I go through about 3 or 4, 5 that I skim, I'm very concerned that that's not what is going to happen. So I'm just going to leave that up as we go through the historical time frames for you to use as a benchmark. Now, in the Renaissance period, mercantilism was the trade theory de rigueur, the theory that trade generates wealth and is stimulated by the accumulation of profitable balances, which a government should encourage by means of protectionism, which includes colonization. Then along came Adam Smith, followed by David Ricardo, and in Smith's monumental Wealth of Nations, he deals with the issue of the mercantilist system in Book 4 of Volume 2. I will summarize his 200 pages by saying he was in favor of free trade. That's the bottom line. And his writings resulted in a paradigm shift from mercantilism towards free trade. That paradigm shift had an impact both in the U.S. and the British Empire, and when you're talking trade in Canada, at a minimum, you have to look at what's going on in the United States and not that long ago in Great Britain. Alexander Hamilton, who happens to be one of my historical heroes, because of the work he did in establishing the financial system in the United States, was an incredible intellectual who wrote on a wide range of things, and one of his topics was a report on manufacturers. So in the 1790s, Hamilton was urging America to adopt the protective tariff. The Americans basically ignored him on that issue, although they certainly paid attention to him on financial issues. And then the War of 1812 came along. The charter for the First Bank of the United States of America had expired, and they were fighting a war, and it's a tough time to be without a central bank. So suddenly, Congress, after the war was over, became interested in tariffs. And 1816 was the first one, and then in 1824, they had another one in 1828, which earned the name the Tariff Abominations. And you have to understand, within the United States, tariffs were very much a matter of geography. The southern states wanted free trade. The northern states wanted protection. And if you look back in 1832, they went down. In 1841, they went up. In 1846, they went down again. Now, going across the ocean to the United Kingdom, Sir Robert Peel was Prime Minister, and he repealed the Corn Laws. Peel is quite an extraordinary figure, terrific influence here. If you go, my experience, and I've lived in Ontario for 50 years now, a lot of towns, at least in the Toronto area, have a street called Robert. And while he may be more famous for the Bobbies, the police force, he also passed the Bank Act, and his repeal of the Corn Laws dramatically restructured the British political scene. He initially lost the prime ministership, and the old Tory party was destroyed. The consequence of the repeal of the Corn Laws was that wheat could come in, and grain and other goods from America as well as Canada on a similar basis. Prior to that, the Canadians had protection in that market. This so infuriated the British Tories in Montreal that in 1849 they passed and signed an annexation manifesto calling for Canada to be annexed by the United States of America. Now, this was in a fit of pique. The annexation movement didn't last long, but that was the anger about the Canadian colonists who saw that they had a competitive advantage against the Americans, and the mother country to whom we'd been so loyal destroyed that advantage. A mere 7 years later, Lord Elgin, Governor General of the British North American colonies, went to Washington and managed to get a Reciprocity Bill passed. The writing generally says that he floated through Congress on a sea of champagne, which I guess is one negotiating strategy you should consider, because it worked. And so we had 1854, we had a Reciprocity Act with the United States and natural goods, and people, at least subsequent to it being abrogated, really liked the free trade era. But in 1860, the United States was having huge tensions around a lot of issues, but most importantly around the issue of slavery. The Republican Party held their first meeting in the city of Chicago, and they, amongst the other resolutions, they obviously were there to abolish slavery and to elect Abe Lincoln, but among their resolutions, they also wanted to have a protective tariff. Indeed, I have read the resolutions, and I've never seen any historian comment on this, but it seems to me that the Republican platform of 1860 became Sir Johnny Macdonald's national policy of 1878. In other words, they wanted protection of the manufacturing sector, a railroad to the Pacific, and settlement of the West. So there's a civil war to the south. Canada is gradually moving itself to form a confederation because they were worried about this huge Union army to the south. They were worried about the indifference of the Liberal government in the United Kingdom, especially Gladstone, who only saw the expense side of the colonies, not the benefits. There was political chaos in the province of Canada, deadlock after deadlock. And in Atlantic Canada, if they were going to come in, finally there was an opportunity to do so because the wind and sail economy was ending, the age of steam was here, and suddenly you would be able to connect Eastern Canada with Montreal by way of the railroad. So there was a lot happening. And as you all know, in 1867, the Imperial Parliament passed the British North American Act. But the year before they passed it, in 1866, the United States abrogated the Reciprocity Treaty. Now, I have been told, and I'm sure Larry or one of our other distinguished speakers will let me know if this is accurate, that that is the only trade treaty the U.S. has ever abrogated, but that is what I have heard. So I'd now like to move on to John A.'s protective tariff. And Carol mentioned in her remarks that I've been teaching here since 2005. Well, the first requirement was we had to have course material. So a group of us collaborated on the first and only casebook on Canadian business history. And we picked up broad themes. But throughout this, the very generous donors to the program did not interfere academically, but even though they were successful businessmen, some quite right-wing, they said, in Canada, the students have to understand the important role of public policy in terms of the private sector. And so each of our cases reflects a different aspect of public policy. The three relating to free trade, the first was dealt with Massey Harris in the 19th century, and we like to pose questions that are counterintuitive. Why would Canada's largest manufacturer be so opposed to protective tariff that he'd write a letter to the Toronto Star condemning it, and then give them the information that they can sort that through? And later on, we have a case in the automotive industry looking at the defeat of the Laurier government in 1911 and the 1926 budget, which gave Canadian content for the first time to the manufacturing sector. And later on, when we came to 1988, which was fresh in most of our minds, that was the hardest one of all. I don't know why. I guess my older son had done graduate work at SAIS in DuPont Circle in Washington, and he had very strong views. He felt it had to be a manufacturer, and I had cases for every policy issue except that, and I had lunch with Red Wilson, the lead donor to our program, and I told him about my problem, and he said, well, why don't you ask Donald McDonald? As you know, Donald just passed away in the past month, but I phoned Donald, and it didn't take him long to come up with an answer. He said, the wine industry. And that's what a lot of my friends have been telling me. Brendan Calder said, students really like wine. That would be a great case. And so that's the one we chose. So in the process of that, I had to learn about trade and John A. And so I'm going to give you my interpretation of what I learned, which is certainly not congruent with the mainstream. People talk about John A. being a protectionist, but in his 1878 speech, which led to the election and the victory, he said, moving in the direction of a reciprocity of tariffs with our neighbors will greatly tend to procure for this country a reciprocity of trade. And I said, well, that's really interesting, but that doesn't sound like a strategy to me. That sounds like a tactic. That what he was trying to figure out was how to get them back to the bargaining table. Now, the tactic may not have worked, but that's what it reads like to me, and I thought it was further reinforced in the 1891 election, which is best known because of his speech, "A British subject I was born, a British subject I will die." But he also said, "We said to the Americans, we are perfectly willing to trade with you on equal terms. We are desirous of having a fair reciprocity treaty, but we will not consent to open our markets to you while yours remain closed to us." Again, reinforcing my theory of a tactic. And then, looking at Sir Wilfrid Laurier's speech in 1911, when he was defeated, gracious and dignified in defeat, he said he had returned from Washington with a free trade agreement approved by Congress and the President, and but lost the election, was fought on it because of an interesting combination of opponents, including a group of 18 prominent liberal businessmen. Need I remind the House once more that when Sir John Macdonald advised the Canadian people to adopt towards the United States a policy of high tariff, it was with a view to have a commercial convention such as was negotiated last year with the American Republic. So we enter the 20th century, and I'm going to stretch the 20th century back to 1890 briefly. I would like to talk to you about early American attitudes in the late 19th, early 20th century. Well, we had the 1890 McKinley tariff, clearly divided between the Protectionist Republic and the Free Trade Democrats, and while it cost Harrison the election of 1892, it was on the books. And Patrice and David, well, I guess Patrice, will be discussing what happened in 1911, the Gang of 18, and U.S. Speaker of the House, Champ Clark. One of the ones I find interesting is that the 1922 Ford-Mecklenburg tariff, because it is not highlighted in the literature that I have read. It did not apply to autos, but did to wheat, oats, and rye, and a variety of other natural products. If you get into the research on this, though, here's what Mr. Burton from Simpsons, and at that time the Burtons were to Simpsons what the Eatons were to Eatons. He said, "Canada is the best customer of the United States, although it is treated the worst by the tariff laws." And in 1930, as they're bringing in Smoot-Hawley, an independent member of Parliament said, "History tells us that the markets for our agricultural products in the United States are never of a permanent nature. We must realize that self-preservation is the first law of nature." And in getting into this topic for my other book, I learned a couple of things which I didn't know before, is that the Smoot-Hawley tariff was basically put forward by the agricultural interests. And President Hoover thought he could manage the process where agricultural tariffs would go up, manufacturing tariffs would go down, and there would be a good trade-off. But he couldn't manage it. And the fact is, they had these huge tariffs. Canadian trade went down by 65%. And politically, I had known that R.B. Bennett had been elected Prime Minister, but I thought it was simply the reaction to the Great Depression. But the fact of the matter is, where he won was in the prairies and in Quebec, because areas that were formerly very strongly free trade and wouldn't vote for the Conservatives said, we now have to deal with this issue. So, on the Canadian prairies, they went from 1 MP, Mr. Bennett, to 34, and a comparable number in parts of rural Quebec. So this was of course, it didn't do any good, nor did Bennett's trumpeting that we're going to smash our way into world markets. But any fairly young group here, but let me tell you, anyone my age remembers hearing the stories that our mothers need about the Great Depression. In Canada, GDP per capita went down by 50%, in the province of Saskatchewan by 75%. Saskatchewan actually lost population between 1931 and 41, and it had been the largest province in Canada after Ontario and Quebec prior to the Great Depression. So that was pretty devastating. So what happened after that, I say, you know, the old phrase about things went from bad to worse. Well, they went from bad to better in terms of trade. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected President of the United States, and he appointed Cordell Hull as his Secretary of State. Hull was a very strong supporter of free trade, and an agreement was signed between the two countries, the first improvement in U.S.-Canada trade relations in 70 years. And of course, we all know that in 1947, we had the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and it was signed with the purpose of expanding world trade, reducing global barriers. International relations began improving and if you think of what Jeff Jones has said, he's got 47, take 1950, and that's when things started to get better. Something that is not generally well known is in 1948, Mackenzie King considered free trade very seriously, came very close, but the cautious Mr. King didn't go the final step. And you had, even though things were getting better, you always had that issue of Buy America. It was a very strong movement, and then the Korean War came along, and the government appointed Mr. Paley from CBS to do a strategic plan for the government of the United States. And what Mr. Paley came back with was said, look it, we are not self-sufficient in strategic resources. Our friends to the north have uranium, they have oil, they have other raw materials that we need, and so against the Buy America, you had a Paley saying the U.S. is becoming a world power, we have to be able to access goods wherever we can find them. I'd like to make a brief comment on three prime ministers, Diefenbaker, Pearson, and Trudeau, especially with some notable political biographers in the audience. As I was looking at that period, I was quite struck at the similarities between Mr. Diefenbaker and Mr. Trudeau, which had not occurred to me before. Mr. Diefenbaker wanted to, once he got elected, wanted to divert 15% of our trade from the United States to the United Kingdom. Well, Mr. Trudeau came along quite a bit later, but he was, like Diefenbaker, nationalistic and influenced by a variety of people, proposed nationalistic policies, opposed foreign direct investment, and supported a third option in trade. But in between, there was Prime Minister Pearson, and his government negotiated auto pact with the United States, which created a continental automotive market. Michael Bliss, the distinguished historian, said by the end of the decade, cars and parts had become Canada's largest export, statistically ending the myth of the Dominion as hewer of wood and drawer of water. So I'm looking forward to that panel. Now then came the 80s, and I'm going to move off historian, and because that time was so vivid in my memory. As Trudeau was getting ready to depart, he appointed Donald MacDonald to chair a Royal Commission on Canada's economic prospects, 72 volumes of research, but it boiled down to a leap of faith. Now, Mr. Mulrooney's role in this was clear, and if you don't like the language, I'm quoting directly. In 1983, there was a leadership race for the Conservative Party. He was one of the leading contenders. Joe Clark was the leader at the time, and Clark had defeated Mulroney in 1976, and Mulroney was back challenging him, and the Toronto Star inferred that Mulroney was in favor of free trade. The direct quote for this, I think, is from Newman's book, not from Mulroney's. It's such horseshit. The Toronto Star trying to get me to talk about free trade. I told them, listen, that thing was resolved in 1911. I don't want to fight those crazy imaginary wars anymore. This notion of a great comprehensive free trade agreement is crazy. So, Mr. Mulroney wins the leadership, and in 1985 he goes to Quebec City to meet with President Reagan at the Shamrock Summit, and there he took a slightly different tack. He said, what we're talking about is a free trading agreement that Sir John A. Macdonald himself tried to get. So it was the key issue of 1988, and the Free Traders won, unlike in 1911. I think it is fair to say that it would never have happened if there hadn't been such an unusually good relationship between Prime Minister Mulroney and President Reagan, plus the fact that the Canadian government had a really high-quality team. My personal views on free trade came into focus for me in the early 70s at the time of the Canada-Soviet hockey series. And I had a couple of young sons who were playing hockey, and I was helping out as a dutiful father should, and I asked the people who knew more about hockey than I did who was going to win the series. And I was told that if the Russians got lucky, they might win 1 or 2. Well, I watched a very different result unfold, and there we were in the Soviet Union looking like we were really going to blow it. And, of course, Henderson's famous goals, plural, pulled it out of the fire. And so my conclusion was, how can that have been if we were supposed to win easily? Because we didn't know what we were competing against. And if you don't know what you're competing against, you might overestimate your strengths and underestimate theirs. So I believe in participation, and when Mr. Mulroney, to my surprise, came out with free trade, I got very excited by that prospect. I was president of the Canadian Association of Management Consultants, a very small trade association. But Jim Kelleher was the Minister of International Trade, and he was from Sault Ste. Marie, and he often went to Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and he knew exactly the issues that those in consulting faced when they went to the United States. When I was consulting to the city of Miami, I would go to the airport in my whites, with my tennis bag, and when I asked what the purpose of my trip, I said, I'm going to play tennis. Because if you said you're going to consult, you wouldn't get in. And this is known as NTB, or non-tariff barriers. You got to be a little more innovative if you're consulting to the city of New York. I can't remember how we did that, but it was just silly. We did not have access to this extraordinary market. And so I flew to Washington, and I'm not easily intimidated, but I had arranged a meeting through Bob Teeter, who was later President George H.W. Bush's campaign manager, and I got to the right people, but I was intimidated. And but as the conversation went on, they liked the idea of some free trade and intellectual property. And so we got them on side, called a meeting in Quebec City of the leaders of the different firms, and much to my surprise, they agreed that we should go out and support free trade, which we did. And it was, and I even wrote a letter to all of our employees. I didn't tell them how to vote. I just pointed out, here are the facts about the trade. And needless to say, I was delighted when the results of that election came in, and I was on a plane to the United States the first week of January 1989. And for my thanks, let's see if I can do this now. Where do I push? Oh, no, no, thanks. So I got that nice letter from Vice President Bush. I'm going to deal very lightly with what has happened since the free trade agreement. The macro level, the Liberal government did not tear up the agreement. They entered into a North American free trade agreement, including Mexico. The agreement, and again, some of you who are more expert may challenge me in these points. The agreement had pluses and minuses for Canada, including what I would call the Mexicanization of the Canada-U.S. border, which is compounded by 9/11 and Homeland Security. In 2005, Bob Bothwell and I attended a conference in the Catskills where Jacques Charest spoke. And there I learned a lot from an American perspective about the Mexicanization of the Canadian border. And as I'm drawing to the end, I've heard a lot of people over the years sort of make fun of President George W. Bush, but he did say, while he was president, shortly after the stock market crash in 1929, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, a protectionist measure designed to wall off America's economy from global competition. The result was not economic security, it was economic ruin. And leaders around the world must keep this example in mind and reject the temptation of protectionism. So what now? I don't know, but I hope we'll learn from our panelists. Thank you very much.